Something that Mark said just caught my ear, which is councils have no power, formal power in this process around coal seam gas approvals, which is true. But you shouldn't underestimate the power that you generate when councils together are saying communities don't want this. And I think council shouldn't underestimate the contribution they're making in this campaign. I heard a very funny analogy a couple of days ago that Paul from Ecapella reminded me of. It was a discussion about peak oil, and it was trying to explain coal seam gas and unconventional gas in that context. And it was basically along the lines of, if we've been drinking beer for years, coal seam gas is the point where we've reached the end of the night and we're sucking the beer out of the carpet. To explain that, coal seam gas is a kind of unconventional gas mining. Now, unconventional gas is not the traditional gas we've had in our homes for generations. Conventional gas is very easy, both economically and technologically, to extract from the ground. So conventional gas, you drill a well into a rock formation where the gas flows very easily and from a wide area. Unconventional gas does not do those things. So essentially it's been unfeasible for generations, even though we've known about coal seam gas and other unconventional gas, to get it out of the ground. And it's only because of the advent of hydraulic fracturing or fracking, horizontal drilling, and dewatering technologies that we're now seeing coal seam gas mining become in some way economically viable. Now, just to explain specifically what I mean, to mine for coal seam gas, you need to drill a well from the surface into the ground, through any groundwater systems present, and into your coal seam. The gas is actually trapped in a coal seam by water pressure, so we actually have water in our coal seams. You have to depressurise the coal seam to get that gas out of the ground. And what that means is extracting water through that coal seam, up the well, to the surface. At that point, you can actually have the gas flow through the coal seam into the surface. But the reason fracking and horizontal drilling is so important is that gas doesn't flow easily through a coal seam. So essentially creating what is seismic activity, shattering, pumping large volumes of water, sand and chemicals into the ground to shatter that coal seam to allow the gas to flow more easily and from a wide area. That's what that technology means. Now, the reason the Illawarra campaign started, some of our key concerns, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on. And the first is, not surprisingly, water. So with all coal seam gas mining, you've immediately got a wastewater product. So you have to draw this water out of the ground to get access to the gas. That's inherent whether you're using fracking or not. And water that's been sitting in a coal seam is high in salt, it's high in methane, and it can contain toxic and radioactive compounds and heavy metals. So when you mine for coal seam gas, you've immediately got this waste product that's toxic. Some of those things sound innocuous enough. If I say you've got salt coming out of the ground, that doesn't sound like such a bad thing. But if you get salt water escaping into a freshwater environment, of course you're going to kill that freshwater environment. And in Queensland, QGC, one of the biggest coal seam gas mining companies in Australia, are currently building a salt pit the size of 4 MCGs to house the salt. So we're not talking small volumes. The second thing to say is, in terms of the water itself, the federal government's water group is estimating that this industry, Australia-wide, is going to draw out of the ground up to 5,400 gigalitres of water every year. Now, when I read that figure, that meant absolutely nothing to me, even if abstractly I understand what a gigalitre is. Australian households use 1,872 gigalitres of water a year. This industry is going to draw out of the ground every year 5,400 gigalitres of contaminated water. And so we're talking about extraordinary volumes of wastewater, toxic wastewater, that has to be managed in one way or another. The other thing to say is that when you draw water out of the ground, you deplete groundwater systems. Now that sounds obvious enough, and you might be thinking, well, we're talking about the toxic groundwater systems, so maybe that's okay. But when you draw that wastewater out of the ground, the overlying freshwater aquifers drop down and replace that groundwater. So we are depleting our groundwater systems by up to 5,400 gigalitres of water every year. The third thing I would say about water is that if we are using fracking, we are also taking enormous volumes of fresh water and directly contaminating it to pump it into the ground to crack that coal seam. So it's an incredibly water-intensive industry in an incredibly arid country. The next thing that, again, almost goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, is that coal seam gas is principally methane, which is the product that they want. But methane, if it escapes at any point in the process where you don't want it to, is extraordinarily problematic. It's a highly explosive, highly potent greenhouse gas. Now, if you're talking about somewhere like the Blue Mountains, and you've got gas escaping in this process along a pipeline, a wellhead, a processing plant, and you've got something highly flammable and highly explosive leaking out of the ground, and a bushfire comes through, you've got a fuel source. Not to mention, of course, the people who work on these projects and the risks it poses to them. Now, what is, I think, extraordinary is the amount of leakage that we are finding in the unconventional gas industry where it's been operating for some years. So increasingly we're seeing peer-reviewed studies where we've got a baseline, so before the industry set up, someone has gone and measured the methane that's present in the atmosphere, to now where you've got an unconventional gas field and methane leaking out of the ground. Now, the industry everywhere is saying you've got less than 1% leakage. We've not got large volumes, it's nothing to be concerned about. But what we're seeing is that within 1 year, 7% of wells fail and leak. Within their lifetime, 50% of wells fail and leak. And I think what's most important is, what about decommissioned wells? Because if you've created a connection between your surface, your groundwater system and your coal seam, and you've plugged it with concrete, a material that degrades over time, you've got a potential risk forever in terms of leakage, as long as there's no water still in that coal seam. You've got something that can leak for all time and that the public will have to fund monitoring of. So these aren't just a problem when they're in operation, they're a potential problem after they've been decommissioned. The last thing to mention, and this is actually a photograph, well, it's quite small, from Tara. So where Dane Pratsky, the preview you've just seen for FracMan, is from. This is his community, and this is just a picture straight off Google Earth. So to mine for coal seam gas it creates an enormous footprint on the landscape. To mine for coal seam gas, to make money out of coal seam gas, you need a wellhead every 300 to 900 metres, all connected by roads and pipelines. It puts a web of roads, pipes, wells on the landscape. This is what a developed coal seam gas field looks like, and what isn't talked enough about in New South Wales because the industry is in its infancy. But this is the footprint of this industry. Now, I first found out about coal seam gas mining in 2011, but we had a project approved in the Illawarra, where I'm from, in 2009. Almost nobody knew. So the government had already had long negotiations with these companies, long discussions, approved wells, and told nobody. And the project that Stop CSG Illawarra formed in response to was a coal seam gas exploration project in and around the drinking water catchment for Greater Sydney, with wells in the upper Nepean and Warrenora catchment. So 10 of these 15 wells were in areas so protected that trespass attracts fines of up to $44,000, but companies have been given permission to mine for coal seam gas. And interestingly, some of the people working in the coal and gas industry have said to us, those fines aren't there for the public, they're to stop you from going and seeing the damage that's being done in our catchments, because this is layered on top of existing damage from coal mining already in our drinking water catchment areas. Now, just to give you some idea of the geology where I live, we all live beneath what is an incredible escarpment. So we've got a mountain and a very small strip of housing, and then the ocean. And it's just on top of this very unstable escarpment that these companies have been given permission to mine for coal seam gas. So I guess not surprisingly, people in the Illawarra were concerned. But when you start a campaign and nobody knows what the industry is, nobody in New South Wales was talking about coal seam gas, no one knew the project existed, we needed to launch an information campaign to let people know our concerns and to let people know what had been approved. And we set up a campaign that essentially initially most people came to us with enormous concerns. You know, this industry, people are talking about some of the risks, and I'm quite worried, I don't yet properly understand it, but why is this allowed to go ahead when we don't even know? How has this been allowed to proceed when we haven't even been told? And so the first thing we said we campaigned for is you have to stop. You just have to stop, and we need to investigate, because first thing first, you need more information if you're going to make any kind of decision about whether or not it can go ahead. We campaigned for a ban on fracking, I think for fairly obvious reasons, creating a seismic event and using and contaminating enormous volumes of water to shatter coal seams seems extraordinary, particularly as increasingly we can see peer-reviewed science pointing to this actually causing earthquakes. And we called for a ban on coal seam gas mining in our drinking water catchment areas, which seems incredibly straightforward, but apparently it is not, because we still don't have legislation in place that protects our drinking water catchments. Now we actually set up, I realised sitting there almost 4 years ago today, and it was actually just before a state election. Which is incredibly interesting because Barry O'Farrell, just before that election, promised the next Liberal national government will ensure that mining cannot occur in any water catchment area and will ensure that mining leases and mining exploration permits reflect that common sense. No ifs, no buts, a guarantee.
Liar.
Pretty unequivocal. Now maybe it was because he was ousted because of the Grange and he was about to implement this, but we still don't have policy in place that stops coal seam gas mining in our drinking water catchment areas. However, and this is the reason I'm still involved in this campaign and the reason I'm optimistic and the reason that I'm here today, our community has prevented any one of those 15, which actually became 16 coal seam gas wells, from being drilled, and it did it because we had an entire community engaged and mobilised in this campaign. You couldn't live in the northern suburbs of the Illawarra and not know about coal seam gas mining, and we actually went and knocked on the doors across suburbs in the northern Illawarra and found that in all instances 97% of residents were opposed to coal seam gas mining, and actually of that remaining 3 and 4% it was more don't know than support it. So we actually created a consensus in our community because we informed ourselves about the industry. That meant the project could not go ahead, despite the fact that we haven't yet changed the law. This said we have to change the law, because what happens otherwise is we get complacent or we get quiet because there is no immediate threat, and all of a sudden, through the back door, another project's been approved and we don't know, and drilling started. So we are hell-bent on making sure we actually get that protection in place formally. Now we're headed into another state election, and I sometimes feel terribly cynical about elections, but I also think elections are an extraordinary opportunity to get candidates to make clear their position on this industry, and also an enormous opportunity for communities to put pressure on candidates to take positions that actually represent what we want to see happen. Unfortunately, I think our new and current Premier doesn't support the campaign. In fact, in his words, he asked himself a question, do we want CSG? Absolutely we do. Yes. His words. So despite the fact that we've heard announcements saying we now have protections in place that ensure that communities are safe while the industry can still develop, and while we've got what's called the New South Wales Gas Plan, which as far as I can make out offers no new protections in terms of health, the environment, communities, it is essentially a promise that says, trust us, we'll do good stuff after the election. We're just not going to tell you quite what that means. It's an incredibly important time to still put pressure on our current government and our current representatives, because this is an opportunity for us to get them to change, because they are so far out of step with what communities want to see happen. It's also a huge opportunity to ask candidates who want to be in government to do the same. The last thing I wanted to say, and I think is most important, is Stop CSG Illawarra set up just before the last state election, and we didn't miss a beat. So the election and getting people in government who support us was never going to be enough. In fact, we got a government who promised they would do the right thing by us, and they didn't. What's mattered is everything the community has done since, because they have not been able to drill a well in the Illawarra as a result of the campaign. You have a petroleum exploration licence in the Blue Mountains. You've got PEL 2. And actually, I just wanted to comment, I think correctly on something Mark mentioned, though he's absolutely right to say when you put a submission in response to an application and no one's told you any different, why would you believe it's gone? But my understanding is that actually all applications were cancelled. And so there's no pending applications at the moment. However, that application process reopened. So at any point, a company can put in another application within the new rules that says they can mine for coal seam gas. So it's already gone in. Thanks, Jen. So while you've got a current licence, and what a current licence means is that not only do you have the sole right to explore for coal seam gas in the region, you have the obligation. So you cannot hold a licence and not explore. You've got a licence that runs up till about Springwood with PEL 2. You've also got a new application.
PEL 2, we've got the application to extend because it expired.
Okay.
So it's still there.
Oh. And maybe to be very clear, so there's a current exploration licence in PEL 2, they've also got an application in to extend it.
No, it finished in 2009, but 2011, but they put in an application to renew.
Oh.
It's being processed.
Yes, so, and to be very clear, if you put in an application to renew, it is renewed. It's an automatic process, it's essentially like extending a lease. Both our companies in the Illawarra had to do the exact same thing, and it just rolls over. So even if you've got an expired licence, as long as you put in your application to renew, it's still current. Mark mentioned the need for solidarity with other communities, and I think it's not just that we need to support other communities, of course we do, but it's also because if you get your food from somewhere outside the Blue Mountains, if you get your drinking water from somewhere outside the Blue Mountains, if you get your air from somewhere outside the Blue Mountains, this industry developing has impacts on you as well as the communities where it does develop. That's a photo of the Great Barrier Reef National Park. That's a photo of Curtis Island and the development of what's called a liquefied natural gas conversion plant. So make no mistake, this industry is not being developed for us, it's being developed for export because it makes more money if it is exported. So at the moment, the Asian gas price is about 4 times the gas price in Australia. You need to sell it to Asia if you want to make more money. And this plant has actually come online, and there's 2 more plants being developed right now to liquefy the gas and ship it for export. And I just wanted to mention that so that it's clear the scope of this industry. It's not just about New South Wales, it's not just about Queensland. It's about developing eastern seaboard gas in Australia for export. That's a photo of Wyoming in the US, and it looks like a moonscape. That's an unconventional gas field there. So this industry is not just in New South Wales, it's not just in Queensland, it's happening across the world. And as I said earlier, any well that you've drilled will have to be monitored forever because it risks leak. And the importance of stopping the industry now before it gets that foot in the door and before we're feeling the impacts is incredibly crucial. But to end on hope, this campaign in New South Wales has really brought the industry to a standstill. And it's an incredibly strong campaign. We've only brought it to a standstill despite a government and policies that absolutely promote its development. But we're not yet strong enough, and that's why we haven't got the laws in place to protect us. And so I just want to end on encouraging people to be a part of this campaign and to be part of this campaign for the long term, because we're not going to win it overnight. It's only because we've got engaged and mobilised communities, by which I mean communities in constant mobilisation, talking about this industry and cutting down the constant stream of lies we hear about, don't worry, it's safe now, we've now got the protections in place, we understand it better, when it's simply not true. So I just want to end by saying, get involved, help this campaign win, because the only thing that's going to make this campaign win is not just electing the right people or electing people who say they'll do the right thing. It's going to be people who stand up and demand it of governments because it's too important to lose this campaign. Thank you.